I still remember the sound of it, the specific pitch and volume, cutting through the silence of the conference room like a shard of glass. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a performance. A loud, booming, deliberately theatrical HA that echoed off the white walls right as my voice cracked and the technical data I was presenting turned into a mess of overlapping, meaningless charts. That was the moment I stopped being Sophia, the quiet, meticulous analyst in a chaotic government office, and started becoming Sophia, the person who was going to make Daniel regret every arrogant cell in his body. Let me rewind for a second just to set the stage. I was giving a quarterly update to the Department of Intergovernmental Affairs. Nothing glamorous, just heavy data on infrastructure spending variances. But this data was mine. I'd pulled all-nighters, cross-referenced databases, and practically lived in spreadsheets for 2 months. This presentation was my baby, and I was nervous, but I was ready. Or so I thought. Halfway through, when I was trying to switch from the summary slide to the detailed appendix, the part that proved my conclusions were solid, the system froze. The projector screen went from a clean slide to a monstrous, pixelated kaleidoscope of all my slides stacked on top of each other. It was an instant, irreversible train wreck. My palms immediately started sweating, and my mind went blank. I could feel the heat rising in my face. The director, a stern woman named Ms. Chan who looked perpetually unimpressed, cleared her throat. I fumbled for the mouse trying to reboot the program, but nothing worked. The air in the room, which had been tense with attention, turned thick with second-hand embarrassment. And that's when Daniel, my desk neighbor and personal source of low-level professional anxiety, delivered his line. He didn't even try to cover his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, completely unconcerned about the dozen important people in the room, and let out that terrible mocking laugh. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. Not a sympathetic chuckle, not a polite cough, but a full-blown guffaw that said, "Look at this idiot. She can't even run a slideshow." The sound hit me in the chest like a punch. I could feel my eyes start to water, not because of the presentation failure itself. I could recover from a technical glitch, but because of the sheer, public cruelty of his reaction. I was trying to apologize, trying to salvage the moment, and I could hear his ridiculous noise cutting me down. The tears spilled over, hot and embarrassing, right in front of Ms. Chan and the entire committee. I quickly swiped them away, feeling my dignity evaporate, but the damage was done. My big moment had turned into a weeping spectacle. Daniel, seeing my distress, actually leaned forward and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Tough crowd, Sophia. Maybe stick to the data entry next time." He meant it as a joke, a way to play it off as harmless office banter, but the words were a deliberate, calculated insult designed to belittle me. That moment something in me snapped. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, hard, clarifying click. The humiliation was so profound, so public, and so unnecessary that it wiped out every ounce of my characteristic shyness. I realized that my problem wasn't the broken projector cable. It was Daniel. It was his unchecked arrogance and his smug belief that he could mock a colleague who was clearly struggling and get away with it because, well, he always did. I looked at him, my eyes still wet, but with a gaze that I hope was entirely devoid of tears and full of something much harder. I didn't say anything. I just stared until his mocking grin faltered a little. Then I shut down the laptop, gathered my notes with shaking hands, and walked out of the conference room, leaving the committee to deal with the awkward silence. But as I walked back to my desk, the initial feeling of defeat had already been replaced by a quiet, ice-cold resolve. He laughed when I cried. That was the contract. He had drawn the line in the sand, and he had done it publicly and ruthlessly. Now I was going to erase that line and his career just as publicly and ruthlessly. There would be no yelling match, no complaint to HR, no petty sabotage. It was going to be a patient, meticulous, long-form revenge, perfectly executed, just like the data reports I was known for. I was going to wait for his big mistake, and when it came I was going to use every single analytic skill I had to make sure the board, and everyone who had heard his laugh saw him cry. Tell me, have you ever had a moment like that? Where a public humiliation was so bad it actually changed you? Drop a comment below right now and tell me where and when you're watching this video. And let me know the most embarrassing office/school moment you ever had. Seriously, sometimes it helps to know you're not the only one who's wanted sweet revenge. This was just the beginning. The plan was already forming. After the presentation fiasco, I had to reset. My name is Sophia, and before this whole revenge plot took over my life, I was genuinely good at my job. I work for a large, sprawling government office, the kind of place where things move slowly, mistakes are easily buried under layers of bureaucracy, and the lights always hum a depressing tune. My specialty is data integrity and budget analysis. It's not glamorous, but it requires a meticulous eye, endless patience, and a weird, almost obsessive love for spreadsheets. If there's a comma out of place in a 1,000-page report, I'll find it. That's who I was. Quiet, reliable, and deeply submerged in the world of numbers. Daniel, on the other hand, was everything I wasn't. His name was Daniel Sterling, and he was the quintessential golden boy of the department. He had that breezy confidence that only comes from knowing you're charismatic enough to talk your way out of anything. He was tall, always dressed in suits that looked expensive, and he had a loud, booming voice that commanded attention, whether he was talking about groundbreaking policy or just what he had for lunch. His official title was Senior Policy Strategist, which meant he got to deal with the high-profile clients and the big presentations, the kind I had just spectacularly failed. Our long-standing conflict wasn't some grand office drama. It was a slow, steady drip of small humiliations, mostly initiated by him. Daniel viewed analysts like me as necessary, but ultimately disposable drones. He constantly referred to my work as the nerd stuff, and would interrupt me mid-sentence to talk about his weekend plans, even in front of our manager. He would routinely submit his project data to me minutes before the deadline, often riddled with formatting errors and incomplete fields, fully expecting me to stay late and fix his sloppy work. He always acted like he was doing me a favor by letting me touch his important files. But the worst was his casual cruelty. The man couldn't resist a cheap shot, especially when he felt threatened or insecure, which I was starting to realize happened more often than he let on. He had a reputation for getting credit for other people's ideas, my ideas often. I'd done the groundwork for the initial budget proposal for his major infrastructure project, the one he was always bragging about, and he'd mentioned my name exactly once, near the end of the presentation, while praising his own visionary leadership. I had always dealt with it the way most people in the office did. Avoidance and internal eye rolls. I am not a confrontational person. I believed in letting my work speak for itself. That's the classic naive mistake you make in a place like this. But his laugh, that specific, hateful sound in the conference room, fundamentally changed the equation. It stopped being about professional respect and became something deeply personal. It became about a fundamental lack of decency. I needed to understand my opponent better. I realized that my power lay in my meticulousness, the very trait he mocked. He was all flash. I was all foundation. If I wanted to make him pay, I couldn't just get him in trouble for being a jerk. He'd smooth talk his way out of that. I needed to hit him where his ego lived. His work and his reputation. I needed a mistake so catastrophic, so unfixable, that even Daniel Sterling's charm couldn't save him. The government office setting was perfect for this kind of subtle warfare. It was a huge, busy ecosystem where everyone was juggling massive amounts of sensitive information. Key was access. Since I was the budget analyst for the entire department, including Daniel's big-ticket project, I had access to virtually all the foundational data. It was my job, after all, to vet the numbers. Before, I just vetted them for accuracy for the department. Now, I would vet them for accuracy and for Daniel's inevitable, disastrous failure. My first step, the day after the breakdown, was purely observational. I started timing his arrival and departure. Always late, always early. I watched how he interacted with the high-profile data he was responsible for. A lot of quick skimming and delegating. I even began tracking his email correspondence with key stakeholders. Not the content, but the tone, looking for signs of overpromising or negligence. I didn't need to hack into anything, All I needed to do was use the tools already available to me as a budget gatekeeper. I was transforming my role from quiet analyst to quiet corporate spy, patiently building a profile of his sloppiness. He was loud, visible, and confident. I was turning into his shadow, invisible and utterly lethal. He laughed when I cried, and now my patience was the weapon I was sharpening, preparing to use his own work ethic, or lack thereof, against him. The government office where this whole drama unfolded was, to put it mildly, a breeding ground for mediocrity punctuated by moments of genuine, underpaid genius. Think gray carpets, fluorescent lights that always seemed to be buzzing, and endless cubicle farms that smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. It was a place designed to crush the soul, but for someone like me who thrived on order, it was a vast, messy playground of data waiting to be organized. Daniel, of course, navigated this ecosystem with the ease of a shark in warm water. He wasn't necessarily the most competent person in the office, but he was unquestionably the most visible. He had mastered the art of managing up. He was brilliant at the pitch, the initial flashy presentation where he promised the moon and the stars to the high-level officials. He knew how to use jargon, how to tell a good story, and how to make Ms. Chen feel like she was the visionary for hiring him. That was his core strength, the illusion of competence, meticulously maintained by his sheer charisma and a lot of delegated labor. This is where the culture of the office played right into his hands, and eventually right into mine. In a government setting, the people who deal with the high-level external clients like Daniel are the ones who get the glory and the big bonuses. The people who ensure the structural integrity of the project, the analysts, the compliance officers, the budget people like me, are the ones who do the thankless, messy work and are seen as interchangeable cogs. The culture was, if Daniel delivers a fantastic presentation and the client is happy, no one bothers to check the fine print of his data until it's far too late. The crucial detail about Daniel's ego was that it was absolutely enormous, but built on a surprisingly fragile foundation. He genuinely believed that the foundational work, the nerd stuff he mocked, was beneath him. He was a big-picture guy, a concept man, which meant he delegated the nitty-gritty to junior staff who were too scared of him, or to me, who he viewed as a glorified calculator. This led to small but vicious mistakes, things that were easily corrected by me before they caused a real problem. He'd forget a crucial compliance date. He'd use provisional data instead of audited figures in a draft report. I'd quietly fix it, email him, and he'd reply with a one-word "tchx," and never acknowledge the potential disaster I'd averted. I started to see a pattern in these small errors, like tracking the flight path of a mosquito before you squash it. They weren't random. They stemmed from his core vice: overconfidence leading to zero double-checking. He was so sure of his own intellectual superiority that he never bothered to verify the details. He skimmed and signed, assuming that the sheer force of his idea would make the numbers work. I remember one tiny, almost laughable incident a few weeks before the big presentation that failed me. Daniel had been bragging to a cluster of colleagues about his new streamlining process for a project proposal, claiming it would save the department millions. I later found the document in the shared drive and noticed he had completely misread a key federal guideline. He calculated a 15% reduction in administrative costs when the regulation explicitly stated the minimum allowed expenditure was 18%. His savings were not only impossible, they were illegal. I had to flag it to the junior analyst working under him, discreetly, who then corrected it without telling Daniel, fearing his wrath. Daniel presented the corrected figure, still acting like it was his brilliant finding, never knowing he'd nearly submitted a non-compliant proposal. This pattern, this constant relying on others to catch his falls, was his Achilles heel. He was a high-wire performer who thought he didn't need a net, simply because he had people catching the debris he dropped. My revenge couldn't be about making him look bad. It had to be about removing the safety net entirely and letting one of those small, vicious mistakes snowball into a career-ending disaster. He was working on a massive, highly visible cross-departmental project. Let's call it the Apex Initiative, which was due for its first major client review in about 2 weeks. This was his baby, his claim to the next promotion, and I knew deep down that the bigger the project, the bigger the potential for an oversight driven by his ego. I just had to be patient, keep my head down, and wait for the one small, ugly data point he was too arrogant to notice. To truly understand the depth of the humiliation, you have to picture the weeks leading up to the failed presentation. It wasn't just a technical glitch. It was the culmination of sheer exhaustion and Daniel's deliberate, tactical sabotage. I was running on fumes. The presentation was originally scheduled for the end of the month, which gave me plenty of time to finalize the data, but Ms. Chen moved it up 2 weeks with less than 48 hours notice. The pressure was already immense. That's where Daniel came in. The day before my presentation, he came over to my desk, looking stressed but trying to mask it with his usual swagger. He had a massive dataset for his Apex initiative that was due for an internal review, and he hadn't even started validating the source data. He dumped a hard drive on my desk and said, "Hey, Sophia, little favor. This needs a quick integrity check before I hand it to the external audit team tomorrow. Just, scan for anything glaring. Be a doll." "Daniel, my presentation is in less than 24 hours, I protested, gesturing to the stacks of printed charts I still needed to memorize. He just gave me that condescending, knowing smile. "Come on, this is the simple stuff. 5 minutes for a data wizard like you. Apex is way more important than your budget variance report, right? Priorities, Sophia. If you can't handle a little pressure, maybe you shouldn't be aiming for the big leagues." That last line, "if you can't handle a little pressure," was the needle that popped my already strained reserves. I knew he was deliberately dumping his emergency onto me to undermine my preparation, forcing me to choose between his critical, high-profile project and my own career-defining moment. And because I genuinely believed in data integrity and feared the consequences of him submitting flawed information to an audit, I folded. I didn't want the risk of a massive departmental error on my conscience, even if he was the one causing it. I spent the next 6 hours, essentially my entire night, meticulously validating his 400-gigabyte dataset instead of rehearsing my own presentation. I found 3 significant structural errors and 2 non-compliant coding issues. I fixed them, emailed him a concise report at 4 a.m., and got 2 hours of sleep before showing up for the presentation looking and feeling like a zombie. When I finally walked into that conference room, my brain was mush. I knew the data, but I was too tired to execute. The technical glitch, the one that turned my charts into abstract art, was the final straw. It happened because the file was too large, a detail I would have fixed if I had done a full tech run, which I hadn't had time for thanks to Daniel's demand. It was a failure by proxy. He created the conditions for my failure, and then he sat there and laughed at the result. The moment the tears started, the feeling was overwhelming. It wasn't just the professional embarrassment. It was the realization that I had sacrificed my own success to save him from his sloppiness, and his reward was to publicly ridicule me. The betrayal felt physically nauseating. I remember tasting the metallic, salty rush of the tears as they rolled down my face, and the sting of Daniel's smug voice. "Tough crowd, Sophia. Maybe stick to the data entry next time." When I stumbled out of the room, my body was shaking. I went straight to the women's room, locked myself in a stall, and had a silent breakdown. It wasn't the ugly, gasping kind. It was a quiet, defeated weeping that left me feeling completely drained. But when I finally emerged and splashed cold water on my face, the reflection looking back at me was different. The tiredness was still there, but beneath it was something cold and clear. I realized that Daniel didn't just lack respect. He lacked professional ethics and basic human decency. And he was protected by his charm and the system's reliance on his visibility. That's when the strategy crystallized. My power was the detail. His weakness was the big picture, the stuff he didn't care to check. I wasn't going to fight him on the surface level of office politics. I was going to leverage the thing he valued the most, the Apex initiative, and I was going to use my expertise in his nerd stuff to find the one mistake he was too arrogant to see, the one that would take him down permanently. The humiliation he caused was my fuel. The tears were dried, and the patience began. I was going to make him cry, but not from embarrassment, from the total, public, irrefutable destruction of his carefully constructed career. After that moment of quiet, defeated weeping in the restroom, the phase of the patient wait began. I knew I couldn't act immediately. Revenge served hot is petty. Revenge served ice-cold is strategic. If I had rushed a complaint or tried to sabotage him immediately, Daniel would have easily deflected it, spinning the narrative that I was just a bitter, incompetent analyst looking for a scapegoat after my own failure. I had to let the memory of my tearful presentation fade slightly, giving the office environment a false sense of peace. My desk was still next to his, which was both a source of irritation and an incredible tactical advantage. I adopted a new persona, the quietly efficient, slightly subdued analyst who had accepted her humiliation and was simply trying to get back to work. I minimized all interaction with him, offering only clipped, professional acknowledgments when necessary. Daniel, naturally, took this as a sign of my complete capitulation. He would sometimes lean over and make a patronizing comment like, "Glad to see you're keeping busy, Sophia. Stick to the numbers, that's your sweet spot." He genuinely believed he had won, and that arrogance was the invisible net I was slowly weaving around him. My surveillance was subtle, relying entirely on the systems and workflows already in place. Since I was the budget analyst, I was looped into every major communication stream for the Apex initiative, the project that was his crowning achievement. I wasn't just checking the final summary reports anymore. I was now tracking the source files, the input from various contractors, and the cross-referencing with federal regulations. It was like sifting through a mountain of sand for a single perfect grain of gold, except my grain of gold was a single, career-ending structural flaw. I started by creating a secondary, highly detailed checklist, a personalized Daniel Sterling audit. This wasn't official. It was for me. It tracked his common errors, based on my previous, unpaid-for rescues. Provisional data reliance. Does he use preliminary, non-vetted figures for client-facing metrics? He always did. Regulatory misinterpretation. Has he simplified or ignored complex compliance mandates? A frequent issue. Cross-reference gaps. Are the financial projections divorced from the operational capacity reported by the field teams? His biggest blind spot. I spent entire days deep in the bowels of the shared server, following the digital paper trail of the Apex initiative. Daniel excelled at generating high-level metrics that looked good on a slide. He could talk about billions in projected returns with absolute conviction. But when you drilled down, the numbers started to whisper contradictions. My most critical move was to establish a silent, digital perimeter. I realized Daniel rarely checked the metadata or the version control history of the documents he signed off on. He'd glance at the executive summary, see the impressive figures, and slap his digital signature on it. So, I started quietly downloading all key documents immediately after they were signed off by him, creating my own secure time-stamped archive. This wasn't to correct his mistakes, as I used to do. This was to preserve the evidence of his mistakes exactly as he approved them. I was building the case file for the prosecution. The emotional connection I developed during this period was a bizarre mix of intense focus and chilling calm. Every tedious hour spent cross-referencing a state funding allocation with a federal grant requirement was a conscious act of preparation for the moment he would inevitably crash. I felt zero guilt, zero hesitation. His loud, mocking laugh was the constant background hum to my quiet, meticulous work. It was the only soundtrack I needed. I was determined to show him that the quiet, meticulous work he mocked was infinitely more powerful than his flashy, fragile facade. I wasn't looking for a small error. I was waiting for the one mistake big enough to hit the headlines, the one that would prove his incompetence wasn't a fluke, but a fundamental characteristic of his entire professional approach. I just had to keep watching and keep archiving. My patience, that quiet, boring, undervalued asset, finally paid off about 10 days into my silent surveillance. The focus of my investigation was still Daniel's Apex initiative, a multi-billion-dollar project involving cross-border resource allocation. The sheer scale of the project was why Daniel was so confident, It was too massive for anyone to effectively check all the details. But I wasn't just anyone. I was the person whose job it was to check the details. The flaw I found was buried deep, a structural cancer masquerading as a common typo. Daniel had presented a beautiful cost-saving measure involving a major supply chain shift to a new, cheaper provider based in an adjacent region. The cost analysis looked great on the surface. He was boasting about a projected 30% reduction in logistical expenses, the very figure that was supposed to catapult him into his promotion. I spent an entire evening cross-referencing the legal compliance documents for the new supply region with the specific terms of the Apex Initiative's federal grant funding. Daniel, in his haste to secure the lowest cost and look like a genius, had completely missed a critical piece of legislation, let's call it Regulation 14B, which applied specifically to the transport of sensitive infrastructure materials across that particular border. Regulation 14B was complex, requiring specialized, expensive government-certified carriers for certain materials, precisely the kind of materials Daniel's project required. When I factored in the mandated cost of using the certified carriers required by Regulation 14B, the projected 30% saving didn't just disappear. It flipped entirely. Instead of saving money, the new logistics plan created a mandatory, unbudgeted cost increase of 22%. This wasn't just a budget overage. This was a fundamental, structural miscalculation that invalidated the entire financial premise of the Apex Initiative. His grand cost-saving plan was actually a $500 million time bomb. The fatal flaw was his reliance on a junior contractor's summary of the region's economic incentives, which focused only on general tax breaks and completely failed to mention the specific transport requirements. Daniel, of course, had simply rubber-stamped the summary without verifying it against the federal rulebook. He saw 30% cheaper and stopped reading. His arrogance had created the perfect mistake. The beauty of this error was its nature. It wasn't a typo or a formatting issue that could be quietly corrected. It was a compliance catastrophe that made the project financially unfeasible under current law. If this error went public, it wouldn't just be an embarrassment. It would lead to a halt of all funding and a formal inquiry into gross negligence. I knew Daniel was preparing for a crucial live client call in 2 days with the Regional Steering Committee, the people who would be authorizing the next massive tranche of funding based largely on his cost-saving projections. He was going to use the flawed 30% saving number as the centerpiece of his presentation, blissfully unaware that the very foundation of his claim was rotten. I didn't alert anyone. I didn't send an anonymous email. I didn't even correct the data in the shared drive. My only action was to quietly update my personal Daniel Sterling audit checklist. Fatal flaw found and verified. Compliance catastrophe. Regulation 14B ignored. Instead, I focused my energy on documentation. I prepared a clean side-by-side analysis, showing the flawed cost projection using Daniel's numbers and the corrected cost projection when Regulation 14B was properly applied. Every figure was sourced, dated, and cross-referenced to the signed documents in my private archive. It was a masterpiece of analytical rigor, and it was going to serve as the irrefutable evidence of his negligence. I looked at the files, the meticulously crafted evidence package, and I felt a deep, almost frightening sense of calm. He had laughed when I cried because I was disorganized, tired, and momentarily incompetent due to his deliberate distractions. I was now going to make him cry because I was meticulous, patient, and had achieved total, cold-blooded competence. The stage was set. The live client call was the performance, and I was holding the script for his downfall. The countdown was on. The 2 days leading up to the client call felt like an eternity compressed into 48 hours of hyper-awareness. Daniel was completely oblivious, radiating the kind of manic confidence that only comes when you've convinced yourself you're untouchable. He spent the time rehearsing his presentation, not by checking data, but by perfecting his power poses and refining his charismatic delivery. He was talking constantly about the historic savings of the Apex Initiative logistics plan, the exact thing that was about to explode in his face. He even came over to my desk, tapping on the edge of my monitor with a condescending smile. "Hey, Sophia, feeling good about my deck," he said too loud. "Remember that big number? The 30% savings. That's what gets people excited. You analysts, you get too stuck in the weeds. People want the big headline, the wow factor. That's strategy." I just looked up, gave him a small, placid nod and said, "I'm sure the numbers are very impressive, Daniel." The irony was so thick I could practically chew on it, but he missed it entirely. He took my calmness as confirmation that I was back in my box, subdued and accepting his superiority. He walked away whistling, ready for his moment in the sun. My final preparations were mechanical and cold. I did a systems check. My external monitors were calibrated, my screen recording software was installed, tested and running smoothly, and my compiled evidence package, the side-by-side comparison of his flawed data versus the Regulation 14B compliant data, was securely saved and ready to be forwarded. I even made sure my internet connection was flawless. I wouldn't have my moment ruined by a technical glitch. The call was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Friday. Everyone who mattered was dialing in. Ms. Chen, the entire departmental committee, and most importantly, the high-ranking representatives from the regional steering committee, the people holding the purse strings for the Apex initiative. I chose my position carefully. Our office had one of those large, centralized conference rooms with a massive video wall for global calls. I sat near the back at a side table with my laptop open. My role was purely observational. Daniel hadn't even requested my presence, but since my data was peripherally involved, I claimed a spot. I made myself small, a non-entity, focusing intently on my screen as if I were working on something totally unrelated. The atmosphere in the room was electric. Daniel took center stage, adjusting his tie one last time. He looked like he was about to give an Oscar acceptance speech. The video wall flickered to life, showing the stern, expectant faces of the steering committee. As the meeting started, the tension in the room ratcheted up. I could feel my pulse thumping, a deep drum beat of anticipation. This wasn't about the small mistakes anymore. This was about the $500 million time bomb I knew was ticking inside his presentation deck. He was starting with a high-level overview, the smooth, impressive talk track he was so good at. He flashed the beautiful, polished slides. He spoke confidently about synergies and streamlined efficiency. And then came the moment I was waiting for. He clicked to the slide titled, Logistics Reengineering, a 30% cost-saving model. The number, massive and glowing red on the screen, was the centerpiece of his entire pitch. He started describing the cheap, non-certified carrier solution that violated Regulation 14B. As he began to speak the words that would trigger the disaster, I started my recording. The screen capture software began silently cataloging every word he said, every number he showed, and every visual cue of his supreme, dangerous confidence. The final countdown had reached 0. The only sound in the room besides Daniel's voice was the faint, constant hum of the air conditioning, and the cold, steady drumming of my heart. His moment of triumph was about to become a very public, very permanent execution. Daniel was brilliant for the first 10 minutes. He had the kind of stage presence that could sell ice to an Inuit. He moved through the initial slides with a flourish, detailing the problem, the need for efficiency, and then the big reveal, the logistics restructuring with a 30% savings. He paused for dramatic effect right before showing the final projected budget. The video wall held the attention of everyone in the room and everyone dialing in. And this, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel announced, his voice smooth and triumphant, is the game changer. By transitioning to this streamlined local carrier option, we not only cut costs by nearly a third but also demonstrate fiscal agility that the department has never seen. We're looking at $500 million retained in the next 3 years, all thanks to leveraging innovation over legacy systems. He clicked to the slide showing the final glossy budget summary. The savings number was huge, flashing green and looking completely irresistible. Then one of the steering committee members, a sharp, older man named Mr. Harrison, spoke up from the video feed. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "Daniel, thank you. That is indeed a striking figure. I have one small question on the logistics cost cutting. Can you pull up the detailed breakdown of the new carrier selection? Specifically, I'd like to see the compliance verification for Regulation 14B, Mr. Harrison requested. The air in the room instantly shifted. Regulation 14B. The name of the structural flaw. It was like someone had dropped an ice cube down Daniel's collar. I saw a flicker of genuine panic cross his face, replaced milliseconds later by a forced, confident smile. Ah, yes, Regulation 14B, Daniel chuckled, trying to sound dismissive. That's, the standard cross-border material transport requirement. Our logistics team, the experts, have fully vetted that. It's all green across the board. Nothing to worry about. We have a summary of the compliance certificate. He clicked to the appendix, pulling up the contractor's summary, the same document that was entirely silent on the costs of certified transport. He clearly thought this superficial summary would satisfy them. But Mr. Harrison didn't back down. I appreciate the summary, Daniel. But with this significant change in supply chain, we need to confirm the underlying cost calculation based on 14B. As you know, that regulation mandates the use of only carriers certified for sensitive materials, which are significantly more expensive than standard freight. Your projected 30% savings seems mutually exclusive from the required 14B compliance cost. Can you show us the line item where the certified carrier fees are reconciled with the new regional pricing? Daniel's composure completely crumbled. He stared at the screen, his polished facade cracking right down the middle. He didn't have the line item because he had skipped the step where you check the compliance against the cost. He just assumed the cheap carrier was compliant and cheap. He started fumbling with the mouse, clicking back and forth through slides, clearly stalling. I don't have that specific line item broken out on this summary slide, Mr. Harrison, Daniel stammered, his voice suddenly thinner. That's more of an internal accounting detail. But I can assure you, the total figure reflects the required costs. Another committee member chimed in, less politely. With respect, Daniel, a sure isn't sufficient for a $500 million project. You are telling us this entire restructuring hinges on a 30% saving, but you can't verify that you accounted for a mandatory, federally mandated cost increase. The room went silent. The panic on Daniel's face was now raw and visible. He started sweating profusely. He was trapped. He couldn't generate the line item because it didn't exist in his data, and if he had generated the true line item, it would show the 22% cost increase. He tried one last desperate move, a flash of the arrogance that had been his signature. Look, this is really just a detail for the analysts to sort out. The overall strategy is sound. Let's focus on the big picture. Before he could finish, Ms. Chen, looking utterly furious, interrupted him. Daniel, Mr. Harrison has asked a direct question about the financial viability of your core cost-saving proposal. If you cannot produce the necessary compliance data right now, this entire proposal is compromised. Daniel just stared speechless at the screen, a deer in the headlights of his own massive, arrogant mistake. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. I continued my silent screen recording, capturing the entirety of his exposed negligence and his ensuing paralyzing shame. The client call was officially a catastrophe. The meeting ended abruptly. Ms. Chen, mortified by the public exposure of a major flaw in her department's flagship project, summarily apologized to the steering committee, promised a full internal review, and then disconnected the call. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence that feels heavy enough to suffocate you. Daniel center stage was completely motionless. His face was pale, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and rumpled. He didn't even notice as the others in the room, a few junior staff and a very, very angry Ms. Chen, started shuffling out. He was staring at the video wall where the stern faces of the committee members had just vanished, his entire reality crumbling in front of him. His big-picture strategy had just been eviscerated by a small, boring weed of regulation he was too arrogant to acknowledge. I, meanwhile, remained seated at the side table, My laptop still open. My job wasn't quite done. The live humiliation was phase 1. The permanent record and delivery were phase 2. My screen recording captured the entire exchange. Daniel's confident initial presentation of the flawed data, Mr. Harrison's surgical question about Regulation 14B, Daniel's desperate fumbling, and Ms. Chen's final furious intervention. It was irrefutable proof of professional negligence, presented in high-definition video. I quickly saved the file, naming it something neutral but devastating. Apex Initiative. Client call October 22, 2025. Compliance Viability Review. I then pulled up the evidence package I'd prepared. This wasn't just a video. It was a full indictment. I created a single, professional PDF document containing 3 items. Executive summary of findings. A 1-page dispassionate analysis detailing Daniel's proposed cost-saving figure, 30%, versus the mandated cost increase, 22%, when factoring in Regulation 14B. The math was clean, simple, and undeniable. Source documentation. Screenshots of the specific clauses of Regulation 14B, directly compared to the vague, non-compliant summary Daniel had used. The video file. A link to the secure cloud storage where the screen recording of his meltdown was hosted, ensuring the board wouldn't have to download a massive file. I made sure the link would be active for exactly 1 hour, adding a small layer of controlled urgency. The next critical step was delivery. Sending this to Daniel's manager, Ms. Chen, wasn't enough. She was already implicated in allowing his negligence to get this far. It would become an internal, messy HR issue, and she might try to bury it to save face. No, this needed to go higher. Much higher. I sent the package directly to the Departmental Oversight Board. Their contact information was publicly available. They were the body responsible for ensuring the financial integrity and regulatory compliance of all large-scale projects, and they took a dim view of multi-billion-dollar initiatives resting on fundamentally flawed data. I crafted the email with the utmost professionalism. The subject line was, Urgent. Apex Initiative. Critical Compliance and Financial Viability Concern. Regulation 14B. The body of the email was brief, detached, and utterly cold. Dear Oversight Board, please find attached a critical review concerning the financial viability of the Apex Initiative. During today's client call, a structural flaw was identified regarding compliance with Federal Regulation 14B, which mandates specialized, certified carriers for specific project materials. This flaw invalidates the project's core cost-saving projections. The attached document provides a detailed breakdown of the error. A video recording of today's client discussion, demonstrating the impact of this oversight, can be accessed via the link on page 3 of the PDF. Immediate attention is requested prior to the authorization of the next funding tranche. Sincerely, Sophia. My last name. Budget Analyst, Intergovernmental Affairs. I hit send. Took less than 30 seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. The email, professional on the surface, was a silent, lethal strike delivered straight to the heart of Daniel's career. I had weaponized my meticulousness. He had laughed when I cried. Now, the clock was ticking until the board's intervention would make him pay the ultimate price. I closed my laptop, the screen reflecting my calm, emotionless face, and walked out of the conference room, leaving Daniel still staring, alone and defeated, at the blank video wall. The moment I hit send on the email to the oversight board, a surreal calm settled over me. I returned to my desk, right next to Daniel's, and began working on a completely unrelated, mind-numbingly boring report on stationery consumption. I needed to look utterly normal, invisible. Daniel eventually shuffled back to his desk, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. He was still rattled, muttering to himself about that old fool Harrison and a technicality. He was in full denial mode, trying to convince himself this was a minor setback, not the execution it was. It took less than 30 minutes for the board to respond. Not to me, of course, but to Ms. Chen and Daniel. First, an urgent email from Ms. Chen's assistant to Daniel appeared in the shared calendar system. Immediate emergency meeting. Apex Initiative Review, Board Presence. The time was set for 1 p.m., barely an hour away. The subject line alone was enough to make everyone in the near vicinity pause their work. The use of board presence instead of board representative was the key. It meant the full, powerful committee was getting involved, something that only happens when a multi-million-dollar project is in existential crisis. Daniel's face, already pale, went ashen when he saw the notification. He knew instinctively that this was not a meeting to sort out the details. This was an inquiry. He started frantically clicking through his files, desperately searching for the Regulation 14B data he had never properly vetted. He spent 20 minutes in a silent, panic-stricken frenzy, his fingers trembling on the keyboard. He kept clicking into the original contractor summaries, looking for the safety net that I had already ensured was gone. Then came the second, more damning signal. A high-priority, all-staff email was circulated from Ms. Chen's account. It was brief and formal. Effective immediately. All spending and operational activity related to the Apex initiative is paused pending an internal review of compliance protocols. Further updates to follow. Complete immediate project halt. That was the board's first move, filtering down through Ms. Chen. They hadn't wasted a second. The fact that they issued a full stop before Daniel's 1 p.m. meeting meant they had already reviewed my evidence package, the PDF and, most critically, the video recording of his incompetence. My detailed analysis had bypassed the usual bureaucratic drag and gone straight to the top, where the truth, backed by data, could not be ignored or spun. The noise level in the office dropped by half. Everyone knew what this meant. The Apex initiative was Daniel's personal empire, his fast track to the executive level. Halting it was tantamount to a full public repudiation of his work and competence. Coworkers began exchanging nervous glances. They didn't know the full story, only the humiliating collapse on the client call, but the emergency halt confirmed their worst suspicions. Daniel was in serious trouble. He finally looked up from his computer, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked at me, sitting there quietly analyzing stationary reports, and for a terrifying second, I thought he might suspect me. He saw the quiet, demure analyst he had mocked, the one he had told to stick to data entry. But his panic was too overwhelming. He couldn't put the pieces together. He didn't connect my humiliation to his impending downfall. He was too consumed by the terror of his own exposed failure. He grabbed his laptop bag, muttered something that sounded like a curse, and walked toward the high-security conference room where the board meeting was to be held. As he walked past me, his anxiety radiated off him like heat. He had been so arrogant, so certain his charm would cover any structural weakness. Now, his carefully constructed career was dissolving into bureaucracy, and the sound of his loud, mocking laugh was finally starting to fade, replaced by the silence of his impending reckoning. The next hour was the longest and quietest of my professional life. Daniel was locked in the high-security conference room, facing the board. I stayed at my desk, seemingly focused on my reports, but every fiber of my attention was tuned to the muffled sounds coming from down the hall. My vengeance was now in the hands of the system, and I just had to wait for the verdict. The conference room where they met was the same one where Daniel had laughed at me. It was set up with one-way glass, designed so observers could watch presentations without distracting the speaker. That glass, which had framed my humiliation, was now the window to his. Around 2:15 p.m., I heard the faint click of the conference room door unlocking. My heart gave a sharp, involuntary jump. The meeting was over. I kept my head down, typing slowly, forcing myself not to look immediately. Then I heard footsteps, the heavy, measured cadence of several people walking out. First came the members of the board, a group of stone-faced executives who looked utterly unimpressed and deeply displeased. They walked right past, their silence more potent than any shout. They hadn't needed to say a word. The project halt was already the statement. Then came Ms. Chen. She looked defeated, her stern composure completely shattered. She didn't even glance toward her office. She simply walked past our area, her shoulders slumped, heading toward the elevator. The failure of the Apex initiative was her failure of oversight, and the damage to her own career was clear. Finally, the last person to emerge. It was Daniel. He was a wreck, not just professionally but physically. His tie was loose, his hair was disheveled, and his expensive jacket was hanging crookedly on his frame. He wasn't walking with his usual swagger. He was stumbling, his hand braced against the wall. And then I saw it. Tears. He wasn't sobbing loudly or dramatically. The breakdown was quiet and deeply internal, far more devastating than my own public crying fit had been. His eyes were red-rimmed. His lower lip was trembling uncontrollably, and fat, silent tears were streaming down his face, leaving tracks in the sheen of sweat and oil. He didn't even attempt to wipe them away. He looked completely, utterly broken. He stopped just a few feet from my desk. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring blankly at the wall of cubicles, seeing nothing. The man who had mocked me for being unable to handle pressure was now standing in front of everyone, the remaining staff who were pretending not to look, crying in silent, humiliating defeat. The board had not just identified a mistake. They had exposed the utter fragility of his competence and ego. I finally looked up from my laptop, giving him a long, steady look. I didn't smile. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just watched him, the quiet analyst, watching the spectacular public collapse of the arrogant strategist. He finally caught my eye. In that moment, something passed between us. He didn't connect the dots to my revenge. He was too far gone for rational thought, but he recognized the quiet, meticulous person he had laughed at. He saw the person he had belittled for sticking to the data entry. His wet eyes widened slightly, not in suspicion, but in a raw, almost childlike shame. He quickly turned away, unable to hold my gaze, and practically ran back to his desk. He dropped into his chair, covered his face with his hands, and that's when the quiet breakdown became audible. Muffled, deep, and wretched sobs. He was crying in front of everyone, not just the board but the analysts, the admins, the people he had always looked down on. The circle was complete. He had laughed when I cried, turning my genuine distress into a spectacle. Now I had waited, prepared, and delivered a consequence so final and so public that the tears streaming down his face represented the irreversible, total end of his golden boy career. The revenge wasn't just sweet. It was meticulously and deservedly earned. I watched him cry for a solid 5 minutes before he finally grabbed his coat and bag, still weeping quietly, and shambled out of the office without saying a single word to anyone. The man who always needed the last loud word was gone in a pathetic, public whimper. I knew with a chilling certainty that he wouldn't be back. He wasn't fired immediately. That process would take a few days of bureaucratic wrangling, but the project halt and the board's verdict were the professional equivalent of the death penalty. He had nothing left to pitch, nothing left to brag about, and no credibility to charm his way back up. My colleagues kept their heads down, but the energy in the office had fundamentally shifted. They knew Daniel was finished, and they knew the failure was rooted in a foundational data error, the very kind of detailed work they usually ignored. No one looked at me suspiciously. I had simply returned to my job, the quiet analyst who had done her duty by alerting the proper channels to a compliance flaw. I was the one who had stayed in her lane, while the strategist had driven off a cliff. That afternoon, Ms. Chen's assistant sent me a terse email requesting all my source documentation related to the Apex Initiative compliance review. It was professional, but the undertone was clearly, "Give us everything you have so we can clean up this disaster." I calmly forwarded my full evidence package, the Regulation 14B analysis, the source files, and the link to the video recording of Daniel's meltdown. But this time I sent it only to Ms. Chen, not the board. The damage was done. The information had served its purpose. I was now cooperating, not instigating. Later that week, I heard the full, unofficial story. The board determined Daniel's negligence had put the department at massive financial risk and was grounds for immediate termination. He had been escorted out of the building. The Apex initiative was being completely restructured. And guess who was tasked with a meticulous multi-week job of auditing every single data point to ensure compliance before any activity could resume?
Me.
The data entry nerd. I sat at my desk, looking at the suddenly empty chair next to me, the spot where he had issued his cruel, mocking laugh just a couple of weeks earlier. I had achieved my goal. He laughed when I cried, and I had waited patiently, leveraged my core strength, and made him cry in front of everyone who mattered. It was complete, satisfying, and cold. But as I started the tedious, necessary work of fixing his $500 million mess, a thought began to linger, a small, unsettling whisper of doubt. The justice was perfect. The vengeance was complete. But I had executed it with such dispassionate precision. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't threatened, and I hadn't even felt a flicker of pity when I saw him broken and weeping. I had simply turned my meticulousness into a weapon. Did I become the same kind of cold, calculating person he was, just with better data management skills? My integrity had saved the department from a compliance disaster. That much was true. But my motivation was rooted in the emotional wound he inflicted. He had weaponized arrogance. I had weaponized data. The outcome was justice, but the act of orchestrating his downfall was a deliberate, 2-week exercise in professional cruelty. I don't know the answer. Kept working. Kept checking the numbers. The quiet hum of the office returned to normal, but I knew I had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement for myself. I was no longer the quiet analyst who just fixed other people's mistakes. I was Sophia, the person who understood that in this office, silence and detail are far more powerful than any loud, arrogant show. I got the promotion a few months later. I took Daniel's old corner office, the one with the slightly better view. I still check every compliance document with religious fervor, but now I do it for myself. And every time I sit down at my desk, I remember the sound of his mocking laugh, and the sight of his final silent tears. It was an expensive, hard-learned lesson for both of us. If you like this story of silent revenge and justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more office hours stories, and drop a comment below telling me the most satisfying moment you ever saw an arrogant person get their comeuppance.